Is President Trump really trying to eliminate the Department of Education? Here's what he said today.
And what I want to do is let the states run schools. I believe strongly in school choice, but in addition to that, I want the states to run schools.
Okay, but why?
So we're ranked number 40 out of 40 schools, right? We're ranked number 1 in cost per pupil. So we spend more per pupil than any other country in the world. And we're ranked at the bottom of the list. We're ranked very badly.
Part of that is accurate. According to the United States Census Bureau, the U.S. does spend the most per pupil. In 2024, the Bureau reported that in fiscal year 2022, which is the most recent data, U.S. public school spending in elementary and secondary school was $15,633 per pupil. While that is the most that any country spends per pupil, it's not the most that any country spends on their education system compared to their country's GDP. Now, when President Trump says 40 countries, I think he's referring to the 37 developed nations involved in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So if we take those countries, according to the U.S. National Center for Education Statistics, the most recent data from 2019 found that Norway spent the most on their education system. They spent 6.6% of their country's GDP on education. Chile spent 6.5%, Israel spent 6.2%, Australia spent 6.1%, and the United States and the UK both spent 6% of their GDP on education. And then there were a whole bunch of other nations who spent less of their GDP on education. As for the US ranking dead last among those developed nations for education, I could not find that anywhere. The fact is, the United States definitely is not number 1, but we're also definitely not last. Rankings are difficult because they vary depending on what criteria you use, and they depend based on if you're talking about boys or girls. But generally, when it comes to the PISA rankings, which measures 15-year-olds in academics worldwide, in 2022, the United States overall ranked 18th in math, science, and reading out of 85 countries that participated. And then when you compare the United States to those 37 OECD developed countries, the U.S. ranks 6th in reading, 10th in science, and 26th in math. It's also worth noting that all PISA scores for all countries were much lower in 2022 than in previous years because the education of kids around the world suffered tremendously during the pandemic. Okay, now that we know the facts about the education system and how we compare to the rest of the world, let's talk about whether President Trump can actually eliminate the Department of Education. He addressed that today, too.
But are you looking to do that with an executive order, sir, or do you need to work with Congress?
Well, there are some people that say I could. I think I'd work with Congress. I think we'd have to work with the teachers union because the teachers union is the only one that's opposed to it. Nobody else.
Well, there are others who don't want to see the Department of Education go away besides the teachers' unions. There are parents' organizations and lots of members of Congress who do not want to see it go. But this isn't the first time that President Trump has talked about doing this. While Congress created the Education Department in the Department of Education Organization Act of 1979, Trump talked about getting rid of the department during his first term. He was not able to do it then, but he talked about it again on the campaign trail a lot. And then you heard him today talking about empowering states to run their own education systems and just cut the federal government out of it completely. You also heard him talk about school choice. That would mean taxpayer funds would be allocated to families to use on private education. Trump believes that would cost less and would have better outcomes for America's kids. Critics are skeptical of using taxpayer funds for private schools, which are sometimes religious schools, and they also argue that school choice would leave kids in poorer communities behind. But when it comes to federal funds, the reality is, according to the Census Bureau, when it comes to K through 12 school funding, the federal government provides only 14% of the funding for public schools, and the state and local governments make up 86% of funding for K through 12 public schools. So the states are already carrying the heaviest load. The bottom line with all this education stuff is this. Trump has not done anything to shut down the Department of Education yet, though it is being reported that he may sign some kind of executive order about it soon. If and when he does that, then we will have a better idea of how he plans to make this happen.